Hi, it's Dustin Lanier. Thanks for listening. Please find me on LinkedIn for original public sector operations content every week. And please reach out to me if I and my team of procurement professionals at Civic Initiatives can help you be a public procurement change agent. The Financial Data Transparency Act, what is it? What if I'm implementing now? Does it affect the way that I make choices? And what are some of the things I can do to get on a glide path for success? Financial Data Transparency Act, it had been put forward as its own bill, and then it passed as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, and it was something that was very contentious for those who are in local government land, as well as people who advocate for transparency in financial data. In summary, it's going to create requirements for local governments to meet some new open data standards for financial reporting. Specifically, it's going to change the way that the Municipal Security Rules Making Board creates requirements for EMA, which is one of the main reporting requirements for municipalities that issue loans and so forth, but it's going to have a rippling effect on other types of reporting. So what's going to happen? So the regulators, and I'll talk about who they are on the next slide, have 18 months after the enactment of the legislation to issue proposed rules. 6 months after that, they'll finalize the required data standards through rulemaking, so basically 2 years. And then there's 2 years after that to implement the standards into the way that reporting is required. So it's far away, but a lot of the process of saying, well, what is the impact on me and how do I need to change will be starting imminently. The Act requires the regulatory agencies under the Financial Stability Oversight Council to adopt uniform machine-readable data standards to collect financial information from their regulated entities. It's chaired by the Secretary of the Treasury, and it consists of 10 voting members and 5 non-voting members. But the main entities that are associated with this are SEC and Treasury. And in addition, as I said before, the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board will be required to adopt the same standards for EMA, which is the Electronic Municipal Market Access. The why on it was to increase the availability of data, the ability to do analysis of data across different entities instead of what tends to happen in many cases, which is static PDFs, and inability to consume data without a lot of manual touch in order to do things. So what are some of the key standard definitions? The actual legislation is actually relatively short. It's 4 or 5 paragraphs. So a lot of the actual devil will be in the details that comes from the rulemaking. It needs to include common identifiers. It needs to be open and non-proprietary, have the ability to render data searchable and machine readable, incorporate standards developed and maintained by voluntary consensus standard bodies, and be consistent with applicable accounting and regulation principles. So why does this matter? When the locals move towards things, it's going to then create expectations at a state level that we ought to be able to adopt the same standards. So the likelihood that somebody will pick this up and move it to state levels is very high. The current transmission of data is varied among people who are sending this data. Excel sheets, locked PDFs, which requires extensive manual data extraction to do analysis. So that's the argument on the transparency side is we're not unlocking the data, we can't do analysis across these individual reports. Of course, we all like transparency, we all want transparency, we all want analysis. When the local governments and the entities that represent local governments had put forward a lot of effort towards saying, let's slow down and consider what we're doing, their main concerns came from effort, span, and cost to comply. Effort. Can you truly fully reconcile financial reporting at this level of span across multiple entities? Like, are we chasing something that can actually be accomplished? Can we actually do this comparison? So one was, is there an outcome at the end of this that is worth all the effort? Span, it can have far-reaching impact beyond core financials. So if I am requiring information in order to report something to EMA, does that mean that I need private sector entities to whom I gave grants to give me reports in a data machine-readable format so that I can create my reports? So a second concern was ripple, that it's going to flow out. And the third was cost. This bill was passed and it said that there was no cost to implement. Well, of course, many local governments said that is inaccurate. There will be cost to implement this in terms of staff resources, change management, technology adoptions that seem likely across different levels of maturity of local government. So everyone is affected whether you had the technology resources to think this way or not. There is a concept of the unfunded federal mandate, Federal Regulatory Act, the UMRA. So if the advocacy groups are able to say this is actually generating costs, then it can create a conversation about should there be funding in order to implement. I think that even with the concern that came from the advocacy groups, when I looked at it, I mean, there's a long time horizon on this. First of all, it's not creating any new reporting or disclosure requirements. This law specifically allows the SEC and Treasury and that financial oversight group to scale to reduce burden on smaller entities and minimize disruptive change by those affected by the legislation. The regulators are charged to engage affected parties through notice and comment, which is happening now. And while it does feel impactful, it is a relatively long time frame to implement overall. It's 2 years before they even say what the standards are, and then it's 2 years after that to drive implementation. So part of what, after I looked at this and I saw a lot of the, at least in my LinkedIn feed, there was a lot of conversation about this. I think there are ways to start acting this way now, even if we don't know what the standards are. And so that's really what I wanted to focus on and why I thought it would be interesting at this conference, which is what happens if I'm implementing now? If I know that's out there, what should I be doing today to be pre-prepared and to be pre-positioned on that kind of work? So a core is really embedding data hygiene into your change management. The changes that are required, ultimately, whether we like being told to do a thing or not, they are things that you should do in a good practice of implementing new data. These are things that we should be able to do, especially if we're early in development and transition to new systems. You can do some of these things in the next 4 or 5 slides, even if you don't have an army of data architects to be able to do it. It's part of building a process around saying clean data is important, and clean data allows us to do things in a faster way that we otherwise will have to go back and do it if we have messy data that will limit the value that we get out of these implementations. So there are some practical approaches to making data be clean and useful for decision makings, even if there's limited technology investment available. The 5 takeaways I had from reviewing all the materials is, number 1, establish data governance as an executive sponsored initiative. 2, ensure the data stores are known and silos are identified. 3, create the right layers of data management. 4, establish a comprehensive and repeatable taxonomy. And 5 is start practicing producing machine readable reports now, even if you don't have to yet. So data as an executive sponsored initiative. It's important to establish this at a business level. At least in my very small business, we have different data silos because people are off solving individual problems. And then you have to pull them back to the center and say, we're creating lots of places where things live. Our data is an asset that we need to manage, and we need to manage it as an executive function. So the main reason that data loses its fidelity is because business users are creating or replicating or reformatting data for their specific purpose. And then that purpose continues or it changes. So now we're spreading apart because no one has said that the urgency that the business user needs to solve a problem at their level, and that's all they're trying to solve, that if we allow that to expand and to grow without saying our data is a strategic asset, then it's very easy for data to wander around and move into places that we don't need it to go. So defining roles and responsibilities for data management, relevant policies, and data quality procedure is something that executives should speak about. Ensure the data stores are known and silos are identified. Really going through and saying, what are all the places where data lives that is relevant to finance and procurement, both active and archive, things that we used to maintain as active assets that maybe we need to check back in on. Identify where data may be redundant or possibly in conflict. The classic example, at least in my space, which is primarily procurement, is vendor files. What is the master record of who a vendor is? Because there's a record of vendor in your IEP files, there's records of vendors in your procurement bid response. Who's allowed to make changes to those? How do we keep those reconciled? And if one has to borrow from the other, what is the policy for creating a reflection of that particular piece of data so that we're having a full view of the vendors? And if conflict exists, determine which records represent the data repository that is the consistent source of truth. 3, the right layers of data management, a business glossary, a data dictionary, and a data catalog. So a business glossary would be the concepts and definitions of business terms frequently used in the day-to-day organization. A data dictionary, which flows from the business glossary into a more technical and thorough documentation of data and its metadata. And then a data catalog is the pathway between business glossary and data dictionary, and it's an organized inventory of an organization's data assets. 4 is establish a comprehensive and repeatable taxonomy. Taxonomies are individual tags or codes that associate with the markup of data. And having a consistent taxonomy is probably one of the most important ways to be pre-ready for new data centers that will come. If you have a very clear understanding of how your data is organized, how it reconciles back to GAAP or other accounting principles, then whatever comes, the ability to build schema connections between the one and the other is much higher. The University of Michigan, along with one of the main open standard machine readable formats, which is XBRL, they've been building a really exhaustive process of this, that even if you're not using all of these things, the likelihood that whatever is chosen must reconcile to XBRL is extremely high. So you could begin today to walk all of your data sets and all of your data schema to say, is it in a direction where if suddenly tomorrow this was the standard, that we would comply? And if not, you can make those choices while you're implementing. You could make those choices today. These could be part of the design session, is a walk against this taxonomy. And then finally, practice producing reports now. Information that is shared on printed paper or untagged PDFs can only be read and understood by human readers, which is one of the main motivations of the people that passed this legislation, is to say, we can be in a different place. We can make a commitment to making data be open and available, and we have to get people to move in this direction. So if you apply some of the small principles, even if you're not all the way there, even if you're not reporting that, small changes can be tested to increase the ability to read these digitally without manual instruction. And even if the future standards aren't yet known, establishing common taxonomies will put you in a strong position when you get to there. So what is the glide path for success against all of that conversation? So one is just making sure people know this happened. The original bill was tabled and then it was added to the Defense Act. So some people may not even know that this is occurring, and it should be on someone's radar. And there was a lot of concern about this when it was coming out. So if they know about it, they may know about it and think it's a negative. I think it's an opportunity to move us towards some common ability of things we would like to see as citizens, the ability to understand information. And the timelines are ample if you want to get involved. Two is to get involved. So the main advocacy groups that I talked about are 21 advocacy groups that are in this thing called the Public Finance Network. So that's entities like GFOA, National Association of Counties, State Treasurers, National League of Cities, etc. So there's several entities on there, and if you're in a local or if you're in a state, that you may have an affiliate relationship with some of those now. So they're actively involved with Treasury and SEC to make sure that the people who would be impacted are heard, and that if there are costs that should be taken into account, that they would drive that back into a conversation with the feds, that you've passed something that requires implementation. Probably the main reason we talked about doing this is, even though this is out there, it could cause some people to potentially be in an analysis paralysis, to say, well, maybe I should wait, or maybe I should slow down. It's important that government doesn't slow down other work in anticipation of changes that will happen, because you can't base a purchasing or an implementation decision on a thing that is further out in the future, because you could simply choose to go ahead and seek to adopt the open architecture and the machine readable standards today, and you will be prepared, you will be pre-connected. If you commit to a good data hygiene process and really being thoughtful about your data as a strategic asset, you'll be well positioned no matter what will come at the end.